tonight is hot chocolate, from indigenous American rituals to Victorian children's breakfast. I am your speaker, Sarah Wasberg Johnson, also known as the food historian. So when we're talking about hot chocolate, I like to share this little comic that is a favorite of mine. And so it has tea drinkers who say, "Coffee is disgusting. I only drink the finest leaves." Coffee drinkers say tea is just pompous water. Real adults drink coffee. And cocoa drinkers are just, friendly and adorable. And they say sometimes I add rainbow sprinkles. So this is art by Muga. She's one of my favorite comics on the internet. And I just love this so much. And this little trifecta of beverages is one that was definitely in place in the 17th and 18th century. So we're going to be talking about that as well. So I thought we'd start with the origins of chocolate. Cocoa plants are indigenous to Central and America and Mexico, first cultivated by the Olmecs as early as 1500 BCE. There's archaeological evidence of cocoa and chocolate found in pots and clay vessels. The Maya start producing it mostly for religious purposes, and they start using it as a beverage. They add spices. They color it with cochineal, which is a red dye obtained from insects. So that really it really kind of brings the chocolate cocoa connection to blood in their religious services. And they also are the ones who start frothing it, which you can see from this wonderful image. This woman is pouring the cocoa, the chocolate from a vessel on high down to a lower vessel and pouring it back and forth, really froths it up. The Maya also used cocoa beans as currency. And then the Aztecs, who conquer in large part the Maya, also start using cocoa beans as currency and using chocolate for religious purposes. So this is actually an Aztec woman, sorry, not a Mayan woman. So the way the cocoa beans are processed is very similar to how they're processed today. So this is a Mayan period metate and mano, which is basically quite similar to mortar and pestle. You also see people in Mexico and South and Central America using this style of grinder to grind not only cocoa, but also you might have seen similar ones used to grind corn. So they have cocoa beans here. So they would grind up the cocoa beans into a paste and use that to make their chocolate beverages. The Spanish start coming in the 16th century, where we have Columbus's fourth voyage to the Caribbean, where he actually makes it to the mainland. And then most notably, we have the invasion forces of Hernan Cortez. This is a very 19th century depiction of Cortez being welcomed by Montezuma or Moctezuma into Mexico. That is not how it was happening historically, right? It was much more violent, much more conquering. And so that's kind of the introduction of the Spanish into Central and South America. In the mid-1600s, Dominican friars who had been accompanying the conquistadors and early colonists bring cocoa back to Spain. And Prince Philip of Spain becomes really interested in it. And so several years later, you have commercial imports of cocoa beans begin. Columbus actually did encounter cocoa beans on his voyages. He wrote back that they were shaped like almonds, which if you've ever seen a cocoa bean pod, it is almond shaped, but it's giant. It is not teeny tiny, like an almond. So I think that confuses some people, but the individual beans themselves are also kind of almond shaped. So we also have this very, this is not from the 19th century, but it still has this kind of European Western style premise behind it. So this is Poseidon, who is taking chocolate from Mexico, who is personified here in a woman in an indigenous costume. And she is handing him the box of chocolate, not box of chocolates like we would think of today, but, cocoa beans. And he is going to take it back to Europe. So let's talk a little bit about cacao itself. The Abroma cacao is the European botanical name for the cocoa plant, right? So we have this botanical depiction here on the right with a nice big yellow pod, and it's been cracked open, and you can see the cocoa beans and kind of like their white, soft, pulpy pods. The origins of the name are disputed as to which is the origin of chocolate, right? There's chocolate, chicolato, cacahuatl, different ones, but the European style version, cocoa, cacao, and then chocolate. We also have hot chocolate versus hot cocoa. They are not the same thing. Hot chocolate is melted, processed chocolate that usually sometimes it has water and sugar added to it. Sometimes it has milk. Hot cocoa is a mixture of dried, processed cocoa powder, usually mixed with, again, water, sugar, and milk. So slightly different mouthfeels, definitely different terminologies, but in the United States, we tend to conflate the two today, but they are actually different products. Similar flavors, but different products. There is also a very distinct Jewish connection in the Western world. So there were a number of Jewish people living in Spain just prior to, basically at the same time that Columbus is going to what becomes known as the New World. There's an expulsion decree in Spain where basically all of the Jewish people are forcibly removed as part of the Spanish Inquisition. Cortez returns in the 1520s, right, 1527. And Jewish people are among some of the first people to be processing cocoa and chocolate for public consumption. The Jewish diaspora goes to Holland, which early on was part of the Spanish Empire until we have the 80 Years' War, right, where Protestant Reformation comes to Holland, the Netherlands, and the Netherlands rebel against Spain. Part of the Protestant Reformation in the Netherlands is a policy of toleration of other religions. So you get a lot of different religious groups going to Holland for refuge, including the Puritans, right? But Jews definitely are part of that. And so as part of the diaspora, they go to the West Indies, which there were Dutch holdings in the West Indies. They go to France and French colonial holdings until there is an expulsion in France in 1615. Then they go to the Americas, the colonial Americas. There are a number of Spanish conversos, people who visibly converted to Catholicism in order to escape the Inquisition and expulsion, who end up in Brazil and Spanish holdings in the Caribbean. When Brazil is held for a short time by the Dutch, a lot of those conversos unconverso and start practicing their Jewish traditions again. And then when the Portuguese take over, they end up going to other Dutch holdings, including New Netherland, which is modern day New York, parts of New Jersey and Connecticut, although the bulk of the settlements were in New York, particularly the Hudson Valley, which is where I live. And then, of course, the Inquisition also had an impact because Jewish people were involved in the production of chocolate early in Europe's exposure to chocolate via Spain. The Inquisition kind of puts a damper on some of the production of chocolate as Jewish people are forcibly removed and expelled. They take that chocolate making knowledge with them to other countries and other colonies, particularly areas in the Americas where chocolate does not grow, but is still very popular. Today, we generally think of chocolate as a dessert, right? We eat it in bar form, we eat it as confections and candies, we eat it in cakes and ice creams and all kinds of stuff. But in the 17th and 18th century, really until the early 19th century, chocolate is primarily drunk. It is a drinking beverage, much like coffee and tea, which we'll get into in a little bit. Early drinking chocolate was not like our modern hot cocoa. We tend to have just, flavored, we have some mint in there or, vanilla or other flavorings, but most people just drink it straight. In the 17th century in particular, there was an effort to kind of replicate some of the indigenous flavorings in Mexico, so lots of spices, but they also added things like ambergris and perfumey things that maybe we wouldn't think of. That does get toned down as we go into the 18th century. And most chocolate was not drunk pre-sweetened. You would add cream and sugar, much like you would with coffee and tea. And people thought that chocolate had certain health benefits, right? Which nowadays we know is antioxidants, right? That's our big discovery of the last 30 or 40 years. But in the time period, it was considered a healthful morning breakfast beverage, in part because it was not as caffeinated as tea and coffee. So I think in the period, it didn't, hype you up as much as those other beverages. So it was considered more healthful, particularly for women and children. This is a great frontispiece from a book that was published in 1685, a French book on the use of coffee, tea, and chocolate. And I love this image because we have an Arab man, right, with his coffee pot and his cup of coffee. We have an Asian man with his teapot and his cup of tea. And then we have an indigenous man with his chocolate pot and his chalice, really, of hot chocolate. And so this is representing to European audiences the origins of these very popular beverages. Even in the 1680s, which we in the United States tend to think of as quite early in our history, people were consuming all three on a regular basis. Chocolate pots are part of the material culture of chocolate drinking in Europe and the United States. On the left, we have a copper chocolate pot with a wooden molinillo, which is like a frothing stick, very similar to what people in Central America were using by the 17th and 18th centuries to froth up their chocolate. And on the right is a 19th century style chocolate pot ceramic. You can see the form kind of changes over the years. The early chocolate pots have these long, like, stick handles off of the sides, and the spout is usually quite low on the pot, and that was in part because chocolate was much thicker than coffee or tea. But that spout was also quite difficult to clean, which is, I think, why you get the evolution of the chocolate pot on the right. The specific pots for hot chocolate were also kind of in line with the specific pot style for tea and coffee. Coffee and tea pots were also very different. style, but you did not use the same one for the same thing. So obviously, the wealthier you were, the more different kinds of items you had to serve these different fashionable beverages. New York became a major hub for the import and export of chocolate. New Amsterdam was what New York was called under Dutch rule, which lasted until officially 1664, but there were England and the Netherlands were at war until the 1670s, so there was some back and forth there. But they are really the major port, in part because they're one of the closest deep water ports on the Atlantic seaboard to the Netherlands, England, France, Spain, but also because the Dutch were major traders, and because they had holdings in the Caribbean where chocolate was being produced, especially Curacao. Here in the Hudson Valley, the Phillips family got involved in shipping cocoa to Europe as early as the 1670s. They ended up being one of the wealthiest families in colonial New York. The Gomez family, who are Jewish, they were some of the first chocolate makers in New York City in the early 18th century. And the Roosevelt family, yes, that Roosevelt family, also were early chocolate makers in New York City. Johannes Roosevelt has a chocolate mill, so that is for grinding cocoa beans into chocolate. His sons, Oliver and Cornelius Roosevelt, get into chocolate, and his nephew, Isaac Roosevelt, was a sugar refiner, right? That's one of our crucial ingredients for chocolate. So we not only have cocoa coming out of the West Indies and Curacao, but we also have sugar on Caribbean sugar plantations, most of which were fueled by slave labor. So chocolate and sugar were also part of the triangle trade, which people like Frederick Phillips were very heavily involved in. The Gomez family is still around. This is actually one of the earliest Jewish structures in the Americas. This is the Gomez Mill House in the Hudson Valley. It's about 20 minutes from where I live, actually. The oldest part of the house dates to the 1690s, and it was built in the Hudson Valley as a mill, but the bulk of the Gomez family lived in New York City, and that's where the chocolate, the Gomez's who were involved in chocolate manufacture were located. We have Mordecai and Rebecca, and Mordecai's brother Daniel kind of get the start as chocolate makers in New York City. Their son and nephew also get involved. And we have documents from the Gomez family. So Mordecai dies in 1750, which coincidentally is when the year before Frederick Phillips II dies. So these guys are contemporaries of the Phillips family. And they have all kinds of chocolate related stuff in their I don't think it's a will, it's an inventory of the estate. So there's a chocolate pot, there's chocolate cups, there's boxes, 50-pound boxes of chocolate. There's cocoa from Suriname, which is a Dutch holding in South America. And then, of course, the assessors of the estate are all his children, nephews, relatives. This is my favorite Gomez, Rebecca Gomez. This is from 1780. The 1780s, these two advertisements. So Rebecca Gomez is advertising her chocolate manufactory in New York City. She's also selling other stuff, right? She's got spermaceti oil, which is from sperm whales, and lamp oil, soap, starch, playing cards, right? And this one, she's got coffee, pepper, ginger, mustard, split peas, she's got vinegar, all claret, which is wine, more playing cards. And then also, I love this, own manufactured chocolate, warranted free from any sediments and pure. Great allowance made to those who buy to sell again, right? So she's also a wholesaler in addition to a retailer. It was not uncommon for Jewish women to be business owners. It was also not uncommon for Dutch women to be business owners. And I think that's, you see more women involved in business in New York, even long after the British take over and impose their legal form of coverture, it's called, where women do not have any legal rights except through and under their husbands. But in Dutch culture and in, at this point, Jewish culture, women still had more power than their English counterparts. Hudson Valley chocolate starts to move up the Hudson River in the 1630s. By the 1750s, consumption in Albany, which is the state capital at kind of the top of the navigable part of the Hudson River, becomes common. And then chocolate milling becomes pretty common by the 1790s in the Hudson Valley and greater New York. New York is not the only place where we are manufacturing chocolate. Dorchester, Massachusetts, and then later Boston, we have the formation of Baker's Chocolate Company, which is one of the oldest continuously operating brands in the United States, if not the oldest. Right, so John Hannon and Dr. James Baker start producing chocolate in 1754. Hannon disappears on a sailing trip. They don't ever find out what happens to him. Does the ship go down? Does he just not want to come home? Does he die? Nobody really seems to know. He's declared dead, and Baker acquires Hannon's half of the company from his widow in 1779. And they're making cakes of chocolate for making drinking chocolate, right? That's their first real product, is these little cakes that you can just break up and melt to make drinking chocolate. As we get into the 19th century, they start to take advantage of the California gold rush, and they send some of their employees out there to start manufacturing chocolate. And their employee, Samuel German, pioneers German sweet chocolate, which is Baker's unsweetened chocolate that has sugar already added to it. So you don't have to make a sugar syrup or add sugar to your hot chocolate. You can just melt the already pre-sweetened chocolate to make your chocolate beverages. If you have ever heard of German chocolate cake, that is where it comes from. German chocolate cake is actually not German. It is a chocolate cake using German's sweet chocolate, which was developed by a man named Samuel German. In the 1920s, Baker's Chocolate is sold to Postum Cereal Company, which later becomes General Foods. And then in 1989, it is acquired by Kraft. So the company itself, still in operation. You can go to the grocery store and buy Baker's Chocolate, right? And you can even make hot chocolate out of it. I love this image. This is a painting by a French painter that Baker's Chocolate buys along with the rights to, and this La Belle Chocolatier becomes their logo for their company. Happen to have a little Baker's Chocolate cookbook in my collection from the 1930s, and they have, here's their classic recipe for hot chocolate. So it's their unsweetened chocolate, and you cook it with water and sugar, and then once you kind of make a syrup, you add milk. And I love this. It says, just before serving, beat with a rotary egg beater until light and frothy. So it's replicating that kind of pre-colonial indigenous way of frothing the hot chocolate before drinking it. Cocoa processing really starts to take off in the 19th century in terms of adjusting the very old-fashioned way of processing it. So the general thing is you break open the cocoa pod, you scoop out the seeds and the pulp, and you let them ferment in the sun. That's part of the processing. Then you clean all the pulp off and you dry the beans. You roast the beans. You crack them into nibs, which start to be really popular in the 1990s as like an ingredient in things. The nibs are ground into a paste. And then for chocolate, you add cocoa butter and sugar. It's heated and conched, just like you like spread it out and kind of work it back and forth, and then tempered. For cocoa powder, right, after it's ground into a paste, there are two processes. There's Dutch processed and Broma processed. Dutch process is you use a hydraulic press to extract the cocoa butter, and then you add an alkaline solution to kind of negate some of the acidity. That's called Dutch processed. Then you dry it and grind it into a powder. Broma processed, you hang it in a bag at a certain temperature, and the cocoa butter just naturally melts out of the beans, basically. And what you're left with, you've basically defatted the cocoa, and you can also grind that up into a powder, and that is natural processed cocoa. These are our 3 stages of beans. There's the fermented pulpy bean, the clean bean, and the roasted bean. So Dutch processed cocoa is so called because it was invented by a Dutch guy, Caspar van Houten, right? Opens his chocolate factory in Amsterdam in the early 19th century. And he invents a hydraulic cocoa press in 1828. His son, Conrad Johannes van Houten, adds alkaline salts to counteract the bitterness. This process is called Dutching, and that gives us Dutch processed cocoa. So if you ever go to the store, and Dutch processed cocoa is very, very dark in color, and it's also smoother in flavor than natural processed cocoa. Broma process is invented by an employee of Domingo Ghirardelli, who's an Italian chocolatier who moves to California with the California Gold Rush, right? Baker's is taking advantage of this, but so is this guy Ghirardelli. He opens in 1852, and in 1865, one of his employees invents, the Broma process, which, first of all, costs less because you don't have to like buy an expensive hydraulic press. It also removes more of the cocoa butter. The press, you can only press so much out because the Broma process is you're just hanging it in a bag at a certain temperature. You basically raise the temperature of the room above the melting point of the cocoa, and it just all drips out. It leads to purer cocoa butter, which can then be added back to processed chocolate bars, which come later. Or it can be used for cosmetics and a whole host of other things. And then that gives you natural cocoa, which the Broma processed cocoa does not have alkaline salts added, so it is more acidic. Beautiful image of the 19th century Ghirardelli headquarters in San Francisco. So just briefly, also, if you've ever had red velvet cake, which today a lot of people actually don't know is chocolate, but it is, because they add so much red food coloring to it now. But historically, red chocolate cake was called red because it used natural processed acidic cocoa, and that would react with the baking soda, and also you'd add like buttermilk or whatever as another reactive agent. But the reaction of the kind of already reddish natural cocoa in the baking powder or baking soda made it more red in appearance than, say, the darker Dutch processed cocoa, or if you were using bar chocolate, right? It is much lighter and redder in color, and that's where we get red velvet cake from. The progressive era, right? So we have the development of all these companies in the 19th century. Milk in the progressive era really starts in the 1860s, but by the time you get to the progressive era, milk really is the perfect food, right? Our early nutrition science focused on fat, carbohydrates, and proteins, and milk. Cow's milk naturally has all of those present. Cocoa was a way to help Americanize immigrants, believe it or not, in part to get children to drink more milk. Cocoa was touted as a substitute for coffee and tea, particularly because cocoa powder was much less expensive than either coffee or tea, and also because cocoa was seen as less stimulating, right? It didn't have as much caffeine as coffee and tea, so it was seen as better for children and also for the elderly, which is what this Baker's Cocoa advertisement is talking about. It was also popularized for invalid nutrition, right? Sick room cookery. It was considered more palatable and, again, less stimulating than coffee and tea, and also having more calories and getting milk into people. That was considered the height of nutrition science at the time. It's very Western focused, but that was the conventional wisdom of both Europe and especially the Americas at that time. Hershey's chocolate. Cocoa powder is actually their first chocolate product. In 1894, they introduced Hershey's Kisses in 1907, and then the more convenient Hershey's syrup in 1926. So that was, you didn't have to use their cocoa powder to make your own syrup to make hot chocolate. They made it for you. Hershey's also works with the United States military to develop what they call D-rations, which is an emergency chocolate bar for use in wartime. Ovaltine, another very famous hot chocolate beverage producer. It is a food that was developed specifically for children, and as in this advertisement here, for convalescents. It starts in Europe, but in 1915 they moved the manufacturing to Illinois, and it contains malt, milk, and eggs flavored with cocoa. So it's considered especially healthful for children, and like the ad said, for convalescents. And in the 1930s and 50s, they are one of the first companies to sponsor children's radio and television shows. So if you know the little Ovaltine, please, like the little ad that they have, if you grew up hearing that at one point or you get the pop culture reference, it's because, it's not just for kids, but they really market it that way with their advertising campaigns. Chocolate becomes very important in both the First and Second World Wars, but in the First War in particular, it gets its association with wartime because it is one of the primary beverages that is offered at the kind of rest areas, I guess you could say, near the front lines. Having hot food in the trenches was super important to morale and comfort. Hot chocolate, really with hot cocoa for the most part, it's considered the perfect wartime food. It has sugar, fat, and caffeine, and it is very comforting to a lot of not very old men, a lot of young men who are in these really desperate conditions in Europe. This image is from the YMCA, and they are serving cocoa. Hershey is also obviously involved with D-rations, but this advertisement is asking people to buy thrift stamps and war saving stamps. This is a big part of the campaign, kind of public-private partnership, getting companies kind of on board with the war effort and encouraging them to sell Liberty bonds and stamps and all kinds of fun stuff. So here they have all kinds of recipes for cocoa. They have hot cocoa, 2 recipes, and then also iced cocoa, right? Which you can get iced coffee everywhere. How come we can't get iced cocoa, right? I guess most people just think that's chocolate milk maybe, but I think they should bring that into coffee shops. I mentioned earlier the D-ration. The D-ration was an emergency ration. It was not meant to be palatable. They did also make a tropical variation, but basically the United States government asked Hershey's to make a high-calorie emergency ration that would not melt, but also not be palatable enough that the troops would eat them as a snack. So they were not very good tasting by design, right? It was an emergency ration. It's supposed to only be used in dire straits. And so they're just not very palatable. However, chocolate was extremely popular in World War II and they start adding a cocoa disc, a little disc that you can pour like hot water on, and it makes hot cocoa for you, to the C rations. And then they update them in the 50s during the Korean War to include sugar and powdered creamer packets. In the 1960s, MCI contains cocoa packets and tropical chocolate bars, which are a special formulation of chocolate bar that doesn't melt at high temperatures. And then from the 1970s on, MREs always have cocoa in them. So hot cocoa really becomes an integral part of military rations. Starts in World War I, not as a part of the ration system, but in World War II, it really starts to get in there as this important thing for troop morale. Also, chocolate in general, chocolate bars. I didn't talk too much about this in the lecture because the focus is on hot cocoa, but eating chocolate starts in the mid-19th century and by World War II. If you ever watched any old war movies or read about war, particularly in continental Europe, a lot of soldiers give their chocolate bars to kids. It gets used as currency and stuff in these war-torn areas where food is very scarce and sugar is even scarcer. But there were also productions of chocolate back in the States. This is a box of chocolates especially designed for the troops that you could mail to your loved one, which was a super fun find. Just an image of the emergency D ration, which you can eat, or you can dissolve it in boiling water and drink it, right? And it's got oat flour in it, so it's not super palatable, but it has 600 calories and 4 ounces. So it's designed to give you a boost if you're in a position where there's no access to food, or you're held down by enemy fire and you can't get out, captured, whatever. It's designed to kind of help you through that. Mexican hot chocolate, right, is probably our closest iteration to 18th century drinking chocolate today. Ibarra is founded in Jalisco, Mexico in the 1920s, and then they make an instant version in the 1980s. Abuelita, founded in the 1930s in Mexico, later acquired by Nestle. Both of these companies are still around, and you can buy both of these in most grocery stores today if you ever want to try. Nestle, I didn't talk about earlier because it's not an American company, right? It starts in Europe, initially making condensed milk, and then it gets in the chocolate game in 1904. Famously, Ruth Wakefield invents the chocolate chip cookies with Nestle chocolate. That's the Toll House cookie, right? That famously is now on the back of their chocolate chip bags to this day. That's also the same year that Nestle invents white chocolate. I put that in quotes because, of course, they didn't invent white chocolate, but they are really the first company to be producing it commercially on any scale. White chocolate does not actually contain cocoa. It is cocoa butter with sugar and dairy, usually dairy solids in this day and age. And so they launch an early Alpen white chocolate bar, which is the first solid white chocolate bar. There is an earlier one, Zero bars from the 1920s, which are dipped in white chocolate. This is the first Alpen white, is the first solid white chocolate bar, which they don't produce anymore, which makes a lot of people very upset, I guess. Swiss Miss, this is one of my favorite cocoa stories. So in the 1950s, sanitary engineers produced powdered coffee creamer for the war, Korean War, and they have wartime overproduction. They make too much of it, can't get rid of it. And so the son of the founder of sanitary engineers has an epiphany. And he says, what if we take all of this coffee creamer and we add cocoa powder and sugar and make instant hot cocoa? So they name it Brown Swiss, and they test it on airlines. right? So you could have coffee or tea on an airline, or you can get this little packet of instant cocoa and mix it with hot water and have hot cocoa. And people went crazy for it. People like saved the packets and took them home. They didn't actually drink them on the airline. And it was so popular that in 1961, they launched the Swiss Miss Company. They really got a boost in the 1980s because Will Steger took 2,000 servings of Swiss Miss powdered instant cocoa mix on his trip to Antarctica. And Charles Hamill only passed away a few years ago in 2019, which is kind of why his role in the development of Swiss Miss comes to light. But just a really fascinating story. You probably have had Swiss Miss cocoa in your life. I know I have. It's still one of the most popular instant cocoa brands in America. We would be remiss to not talk about marshmallows if we're going to talk about hot chocolate, right? Marshmallows are from the marshmallow plant, which was used to make confections as early as ancient Egypt. In the turn of the 20th century, we figure out a way to produce marshmallows without using the marshmallow plant. And we go kind of crazy with marshmallow. That's also the time period when we start putting marshmallows on top of sweet potatoes, for instance. But they start suggesting that you add them to hot chocolate instead of whipped cream in the 1910s. And then Swiss Miss really solidifies the marshmallow in hot chocolate, hot cocoa canon when they start adding freeze-dried marshmallows to their instant hot cocoa mix. We do have some variations on hot chocolate. There's the mocha latte, right, which is a mixture of cocoa or chocolate and coffee. And Mocha is actually an ancient city in Yemen, Yemen being one of the origins of coffee. And Europeans started associating this very dark, rich, chocolatey, if you will, coffee coming out of Yemen with cocoa beans, which were also very dark and rich and kind of bitter in that time period, like coffee. And so when we start mixing the two, we give it the name of mocha after that Yemeni city. And they become super popular in the Americas really around the 1920s and 30s. And then, of course, they get popularized by Starbucks. They start offering peppermint hot chocolate in the 90s, white hot chocolate around 2000, salted caramel hot chocolate in 2007, Snickerdoodle hot chocolate in 2016. I don't know what they're up to now. I haven't taken a look, but we have kind of gone back to this old school ancient tradition of adding spices to our chocolate, right? We start adding all these different flavorings to our hot chocolate. There's also new variations of red wine hot chocolate made with red wine instead of water or milk. The earliest reference I could find was from 2014. The New York Times writes about it in 2016. And then ever popular even today are hot chocolate bombs, which is a mixture of hot cocoa and hot chocolate. Featured in 2018 on Oprah with Carl the Drinking Chocolate Snowman. And then hot chocolate bombs kind of went viral on TikTok in October of 2020. Essentially, it is a half of a sphere of chocolate. You have two spheres of chocolate, hollow, and you put hot cocoa mix in them and then seal them up. And then you pour hot milk or hot water, but usually hot milk on top. And you have both the hot cocoa and the hot chocolate all together. It makes a really rich drink. My husband loves them. We get some for Christmas every year. But it's kind of like the best of both worlds, right? So why did we stop making real hot chocolate? When you talk to people today, when they say hot chocolate, they pretty much always mean hot cocoa, right? But the phrase hot chocolate persists. And it's because it's hard. It's not easy to make, to melt bitter chocolate or baker's chocolate and add sugar and water, and you got to make like the syrup, and then you add the hot milk. It's complicated, even though it is delicious. I think it's better than hot cocoa, but hot cocoa is easier. Hot cocoa is so much easier than making hot chocolate. So that's why cocoa is everywhere. As we saw from my little cartoon in the beginning, right? Cocoa and hot chocolate are really a comfort food for a lot of people. A lot of people very strongly associate them with childhood, right? It's not considered a grown-up beverage like coffee and tea, even though for pretty much all of its existence, except for the last 150 years, basically, hot chocolate was on par with coffee and tea in terms of how people were using it and drinking it. But with the association of milk as a food that was very much needed by children, as health reformers at the time claimed, it kind of shifts to be much more associated with children in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I still love it. So I figure we can end with a question, which is, how do you drink your hot chocolate or hot cocoa? And that is the end of my talk. So I am happy to take questions, or if people want to tell us how they drink their hot chocolate or hot cocoa, they're certainly welcome to.
I still love the Swiss Miss with the tiny little marshmallows in it.
Right? Those are fun.
That's my favorite.
I do have a fondness for the hot chocolate bombs, though, because it's the cocoa, the simplicity of hot cocoa, but then you also have that rich chocolatiness of having the actual chocolate in there. So
yeah, I've never had it. I've never had a hot chocolate bomb. I've bought them for people for the holidays. Never had one before.
So, you're supposed to like pour the hot stuff over it. No, I don't do that. I take a pot, I put milk in it, I put the hot cocoa in it, hot chocolate bomb in it, and I just stir it up till it's hot. I don't go for the theater of melting the chocolate with the hot liquid. I don't care about that. I just want good consistency. So that's how I do it.
Well, Kristen says she whisks hers on a stovetop to get it frothy.
Yes, I am also a whisker of hot chocolate. It is nice when it gets all frothy like that. I don't have an egg beater, sadly, but a whisk works too.
And it says Karen said that her grands made hot chocolate bombs for the first time last weekend and they loved it.
Yeah, they're so convenient. It's the best of both worlds, for sure.
Yeah, I gotta try one. There's a little independent shop by us that has that in their gift section, and I've bought them, but yeah, never had them. This whole presentation just made me hungry, so.
That's the danger of being a food historian is depending on the topic, you usually make people want to go have hot chocolate after this. My husband and I really like white hot chocolate, which I know a lot of people are like, it's not real chocolate. I'm like, I don't care, whatever. It's got stuff from the cocoa bean in it. That counts as chocolate. But I literally just take white chocolate chips and milk, and I just heat it on the stove and whisk it so the chips don't burn.
Really?
So good. Yeah, that's how
I have an old coworker. She has since moved on to another library, and she would call it her emotional support hot chocolate. So towards the end of the day, she would make a mug,
right?
Yeah,
nobody gets snobby over hot chocolate usually. I'm sure somebody does, but it's not like tea and coffee drinkers for sure.
Yeah, my husband's a chocoholic, but he does not like hot cocoa, and I think it's because it doesn't taste as much like chocolate. It is it's a little less sweet.
You guys should try the hot chocolate recipe. I think I have one. Actually, I'll stop sharing here so I can pull this up. I'm pretty sure I posted the recipes I did on my blog. I think I did a blog about like what's the difference between hot chocolate and hot cocoa. Let me see if I can find it. And I have two recipes, a hot cocoa and a hot chocolate recipe on there. Yeah, here it is. So I will drop it in the chat.
Oh, thank you.
So if anybody wants to give it a try one or the other or both, they are welcome to. Yeah, there we go. So I think I have the Baker's hot chocolate recipe, and then I have the Hershey's hot cocoa recipe. Both of them are from, I have 1930s cookbooklets
Oh,
from
fun.
each, so I just take it right out of there. So
That's great. I've also been known to use the hot chocolate K-cups or hot cocoa K-cups.
see, I do not like coffee at all.
Oh
And
yeah.
so if a K-cup machine has been used to make coffee and then I make hot cocoa with it, I can taste the coffee. And I don't
Yeah,
like
yeah,
it.
you can. I'm not gonna pretend you can.
Yeah. Not a fan. So,
All
but
good.
yeah, I definitely, my coworker uses K-cups all the time. He makes coffee, and there was like a one of those big containers of hot chocolate or hot cocoa from like some event from
Mhm.
pre-COVID. So it's like he was like, "This is expiring soon, so I'm just gonna put it in my coffee and make myself a mocha every day."
Hey, that's not a bad idea.
Yep.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Again, thanks for everybody who attended, and thank you to the Friends for funding our program. And Sarah, we love your programs because you're fun and you're entertaining. We always learn something.
I try.
So we'll have to have you back again. But everybody, I don't know what you celebrate, but have a happy holiday and come see us at the library.
Go make some hot cocoa or chocolate.
Sounds good. Have a good night, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.